I had no idea what I was walking into when I took the job at a funeral home. They told me the rules were simple. But when you work in a place where death is the only constant, you learn that nothing is simple. You won't believe the strange rules they made me follow. The job market had never been kind to me, but this time, it felt different. I wasn't just out of work, I was completely lost. My last job had left me in pieces. It wasn't just the paycheck I had lost, it was my stability, my sense of purpose, and maybe even a part of myself. My brother had passed away months earlier, and nothing in my life had been the same since. I couldn't look at the clock without seeing his face, hear a car horn without wondering if it was him calling. But his death wasn't the only thing that left me empty. Losing my job right after his funeral just felt like life kicking me while I was already down. Every day, I was surrounded by reminders of how fragile everything was. The world didn't care if you were struggling. It didn't care if you were trying to pull yourself together after losing everything you held dear. I was desperate. I needed to find something, anything. That's when I saw the ad. An apprenticeship at Lindenwood Funeral Home. I didn't even think twice. I needed a paycheck, and I didn't care what kind of work it was. I thought it would be like any other job, cleaning, arranging flowers, maybe taking calls. A few days of routine, then I could focus on getting my life back. At least that's what I told myself. I remember walking through those doors, my hands trembling as I filled out the paperwork. The air inside that building was thick, oppressive even. The walls seemed to close in on me the longer I stayed. I glanced around, shelves stacked high with urns, expensive caskets, and framed photos of families. It wasn't the kind of place you walked into casually. The whole building felt like a tomb. A tomb for memories, for people long gone. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I was just looking for a job or if I was looking for some kind of escape. Escape from the memories, from the weight of everything that had happened. I needed this job, and I needed it now. I met Victor Stokes right after I finished filling out the forms. He looked like he'd been around forever, older than anyone I had ever met, but his sharp eyes seemed to catch every detail. They weren't eyes of someone who was just working a job. These were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, and maybe, had come to terms with it. He shook my hand, and I couldn't help but feel that chill in his grip. "Welcome to Lindenwood," he said in a voice that was more gravel than words. He paused, his gaze steady on mine. "You'll have to follow some important rules here. We can't afford mistakes." He handed me a piece of paper. It looked old, like it had been crumpled in someone's pocket for years. There were only a few lines on it, but as I read through them, I realized they were more like warnings than instructions. The first one made me pause. "Close their eyes as soon as possible," Victor said, his voice low. "If you forget, you won't sleep for a week, and neither will they." He didn't laugh, didn't even smile. Just stared at me with those piercing eyes, waiting for a reaction. I didn't get it. Why was that important? Who forgets to close someone's eyes? But something in his tone made me pause. The word sounded like a warning. He said it as if it was a matter of life and death, but I didn't ask for clarification. I couldn't afford to look foolish. So, I nodded. "Yeah, sure." But the rules didn't feel right. I'd worked at enough places to know that some rules are just there to make you feel like you belong, like you're part of the team. But Victor's rules weren't like that. They felt like they were trying to keep something locked away, something that didn't want to be seen. I was assigned my first task alone in the mortuary room. The body was already laid out on the table, pale and lifeless. I went through the motions, doing what I thought was necessary. My hands moved mechanically, cleaning, adjusting the body, and then it was time to prepare it for viewing. I remember standing there, looking at the person who had once been alive. It wasn't that I hadn't seen death before. I had. But something about the way this person was arranged, the calmness of the surroundings, it was almost like they were sleeping. Almost like they could wake up at any moment. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the silence, the way it settled over everything like a thick fog. As I finished up, I realized I hadn't closed the eyes. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't like I'd forgotten, just that I hadn't gotten around to it. But then, it hit me, I hadn't followed the first rule. I hadn't done it. I turned around, back to the body, and reached over to gently close the eyes. And that's when it happened. For a split second, the body didn't look right. The eyes, no, the face, looked like it was watching me. It wasn't just the body anymore. It was something else. Something in the room seemed to shift. I could feel the temperature drop, just for a moment. It was as if the room wasn't empty anymore. I pulled my hand back, almost stumbling. But when I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I had done something wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it in my gut. Victor's words echoed in my mind, "If you forget, you won't sleep for a week, and neither will they." And for the first time, I realized that the rules weren't just there for order, they were there for a reason. A reason I wasn't ready to understand. After the weird experience with the eyes, I was still shaken, but I had to keep going. Victor led me into the back, to a large industrial freezer. It looked like something you'd find in a warehouse, not a funeral home. Cold, metallic, and sterile. The kind of place you only went to if you had no choice. Victor stopped in front of the freezer, his voice low, his gaze sharp. Rule 2, limb freezers must always stay locked. This isn't a suggestion, he said, his words deliberate. Limb freezers? I asked, confused. I wasn't sure what he meant, but it didn't matter at that moment. I was still trying to shake off what had happened with the body in the mortuary room. I nodded, trying to seem like I understood, but I was starting to feel like I was in over my head. We moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the freezer. There was something about it. Something wrong. The temperature dropped the second we entered the room, and for a moment, it felt as if the air itself was pressing down on me. Victor opened the freezer door with a loud metallic creak, revealing the rows of bodies inside. Everything about the room was unsettling. But it was one body that caught my eye. It was different from the others, almost like it didn't belong. It was tucked at the very end, almost hidden behind a few others. The body was unfamiliar, too unfamiliar. There were no family arrangements for it, no notes, nothing. Just a person lying there as though they had just been shoved into the freezer with no care at all. "Who's this?" I asked, my voice a bit shaky as I pointed to the body. Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I could have sworn he looked annoyed. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "You'll get used to it. We have to keep some things private." I felt a chill run through me, not from the cold, but from the way he said it. I didn't question him further. But the room, the freezer, they didn't feel right. Something was off, something I couldn't see yet. Later that night, I was left alone to check on the freezer. It was part of the job. Make sure everything was in order, check the bodies, keep things clean. I stood there, staring at the freezer, trying not to think about the strange body I had seen earlier. I opened the door again, feeling the cold rush of air hit my face. I pulled out one of the drawers, fully expecting to find what I had seen earlier. But it was empty. I stared at the drawer. It was completely empty. I could still see the body in my mind, lying there, just a few hours ago. But now, there was nothing. Just an empty space where it had been. My heart skipped a beat. I closed the drawer quickly and pulled out another. Empty. Another. Empty. My breath started to catch in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. There had been a body here. I had seen it. I wasn't crazy. I slammed the freezer door shut, my mind racing. I wasn't supposed to be alone in the freezer. I wasn't supposed to be seeing things like this. But I had. And something was wrong. Very wrong. The next day, the first family arrived. The one I had been told about. I had no idea what to expect. The funeral home felt even darker that morning, the air thick with a kind of weight I couldn't place. They filed in one by one, silent as ghosts. The family was calm, too calm. They didn't look like people mourning, more like they were going through the motions. Everything about their presence felt rehearsed, practiced. Victor led me to the viewing room. "Rule 3, he said, his voice low. "Respect the last wishes of every client. You don't have to like it, but you do have to do it." I watched as the family gathered around the casket, their faces expressionless, their movements slow. They started placing things in the coffin. A pocket watch. A photograph. A lock of hair tied with a ribbon. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect at a funeral. It felt more like they were preparing the person for something else. Something beyond death. I could feel myself growing uncomfortable as I watched them. Victor guided me through the process. "They always do this," he whispered. "You don't need to understand it. Just follow their wishes." I wanted to ask why they were doing it, but I didn't. Something in the air told me I shouldn't ask. The family didn't seem like they were grieving. They seemed like they were waiting for something. Something that wasn't death. As they placed the last of their items in the coffin, I watched them, trying to figure out what was going on in their minds. But there was nothing to see. No grief. No emotion. Just silence. The next lesson came that evening. Victor pulled me aside and told me about Rule 4. Stick to your hours. 4 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Mondays. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday through Friday. Saturday is yours. Sunday belongs to someone else. Never stay in the prep room past sunset. Why's that? I asked, though I felt like I already knew the answer. Because, Victor said, after sunset, the place changes. Things happen that shouldn't. And if you stay in the prep room, you might not make it out. I laughed a little, thinking it was just another one of Victor's strange warnings. But deep down, I knew there was something to it. Something I didn't understand. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. That evening, I stayed late to finish some paperwork. The room was still, and the only sound was the hum of the lights above me. But when the clock hit sunset, things started to change. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there, floating just at the edge of my hearing. My eyes darted around, but there was no one there. I heard the whisper again, closer this time. And that's when I saw it. A shadow darted across the room, moving too quickly for it to be a person. My pulse raced, but I froze. I didn't know what to do. I had already broken one rule today. What would happen if I broke another? The next day, things only got stranger. A guest arrived at the funeral home long after hours. She was an older woman, with a sad, distant look in her eyes. She had a heavy coat on, even though the weather was warm. She walked past me without saying a word, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. Victor caught sight of her almost immediately and appeared at my side. "No one is supposed to be here after hours," he said, his voice tight. "But rules are rules. Make sure she knows them." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Guests are allowed," Victor replied. "But they need to know the rules too. No exceptions." As I approached the woman, I noticed she was staring at one of the caskets in the back room. Her eyes were fixed on it like she was waiting for something or someone. "Do you need help with something?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She turned to look at me, her gaze unsettling. "I've been here before," she said quietly. "I'm just checking on things." I couldn't help but feel that there was more to her than she was letting on. She asked questions about the deceased, about their family. Questions that no one should know unless they were already deeply involved. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I said nothing. The rules here were clear, no exceptions. I watched her leave, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. And that was when I realized, the rules didn't just affect the staff. They affected everyone who walked through those doors. Late one night, after the sun had gone down and the funeral home had gone quiet, I found myself still walking through the hallways, restless. The silence in the place was deafening. The ticking of an old clock in the corner, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the freezer room, these sounds filled the space, but they only made the stillness worse. The air was thick, and something didn't feel right. I'd been getting this odd feeling for a while, like I wasn't really alone. I started to hear faint sounds at night, footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but they came more frequently. Light, but distinct footsteps, shuffling from one end of the hall to the other. It wasn't Victor. He had long gone home for the night, and it was too late for anyone else to be around. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to find out who, or what, was making those noises. The hallway stretched in front of me, its dark corners seemingly swallowing any light that tried to touch it. I stepped forward cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the chill of the night air on my skin as I walked deeper into the shadows. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, there was a figure. It moved quickly, almost gliding along the floor. I froze. It wasn't human. The figure was too fluid, too unnatural. It wasn't clear, but I could see the shape of it, darting from one doorway to another. My breath caught in my throat, and a shiver ran through me as I realized something. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be walking these halls after dark. Before I could think further, I heard footsteps behind me, closer than before. Panic surged through me, and I whirled around, expecting to see someone standing right there. But the hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't stick around to investigate any further. I turned and ran back to the office, my hands trembling. As soon as I stepped inside, Victor appeared, his face serious as ever. He didn't need to ask what I was doing, he already knew. "Rule 6, he whispered, his voice low, "stay out of the halls between 11 p.m. and 1:31 a.m. If you get caught, you won't like what finds you." His words hung in the air. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I already knew. The house had its rules, and I was beginning to realize just how serious they were. I didn't need to ask about what I had seen. I knew that what I had witnessed wasn't meant for my eyes. But I didn't want to ask any more questions. Not yet. Something inside me told me that I had to be careful. Because the more I questioned, the more I would see things that I wasn't meant to understand. Victor's warnings kept playing in my mind as I worked the next few days. I tried to shake the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow, following me wherever I went. Then, something happened that took everything to another level. It was nearing 3:36 a.m. when the power cut off, just like Victor had warned me. The lights above me buzzed once, twice, and then went out completely. The funeral home was plunged into total darkness. At first, I thought it was a glitch. The kind of thing that happens all the time. But then I remembered Victor's words. It was like something snapped into place. I wasn't just in the middle of a power outage. This was something else entirely. I stood there, in the complete darkness, unsure of what to do. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. The silence was heavy, too heavy. I fumbled around for a flashlight, but I couldn't find it. I tried the light switches, but nothing worked. It felt like the entire building was shutting down, as if it didn't want to be seen anymore. My stomach twisted with an uncomfortable feeling, like I was being watched. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there in the dark. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft. Calling my name. I froze. It was distant at first, like a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the darkness. But it grew louder, closer, until it felt like the voice was right behind me. "Come find me," it said, a soft, almost sing-song voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone. At least, that's what I thought. By the time the power came back on, I was standing in the center of the room, my body stiff, my breath shallow. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew that something in this place wasn't right. The power outages weren't random. They were part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to understand. By now, I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The funeral home felt like it was alive, alive in a way that didn't make sense. I would hear strange noises when no one was around. I'd see things move in the corner of my eye. But the worst was the crying. It started late one night. I was walking down the hallway when I heard it, faint at first, then louder. A child's cry. Soft, desperate, like someone in pain. It wasn't the kind of cry you hear in a funeral home. It wasn't the sound of someone mourning. It was something different. Something unnatural. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a door at the end of the hallway, a room I hadn't noticed before. The door was cracked open, the darkness beyond it almost swallowing everything around it. I stood there, torn between running away and investigating. Every instinct in me told me to walk away. To turn around and pretend I hadn't heard it. Victor's words came back to me, never investigate crying, no matter how close or how real it sounds. Do not look. But I didn't listen. I stepped forward, drawn to the sound. I pushed the door open, and there, in the corner, sat a small child. They were huddled on the floor, their face hidden in their hands, their shoulders shaking with sobs. It wasn't right. There was something wrong with this child. I could feel it in my bones. I wanted to help, to go to them, but I couldn't move. The child's head snapped up, and I saw their eyes. Hollow. Empty. There was nothing behind them, just darkness. The child's mouth opened wide, letting out a sound that wasn't a cry. It was a scream, a sound that rattled me to my core. I stepped back, my body frozen in place. But before I could turn and run, the room seemed to shift. The child's figure flickered like a broken light, revealing something far darker, far more terrifying. It wasn't a child. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been there. And that's when I understood, whatever was in this place wasn't human. Not anymore. Things only got worse after that night. I was so shaken by what I had seen that I almost left. But I couldn't. There was something pulling me back. Something that wouldn't let me leave. As I walked down the hall, the feeling of dread washed over me again. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I had made it halfway down when I heard it. A knock at the door. Soft at first, then louder. Insistent. I remembered Victor's rule: if someone knocks after hours, don't answer. Doesn't matter if it's family, friends, or the mailman. Do not open the door. The knock came again. Louder this time. Frantic. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to answer, but I couldn't stop myself. Something inside me needed to know. I reached for the door and opened it. What stood there wasn't human. It wasn't anything I recognized. The figure was dark, its face hidden, but the air around it felt wrong. It didn't belong. It never had. I wanted to close the door, to lock it, but it was too late. The moment I opened it, the thing stepped forward. And it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was in the room, filling the space with its presence, its coldness. The next few moments were a blur. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing in front of me reached out, its hand cold and solid, like stone. Victor appeared just in time, stepping into the room and pulling the figure back. His face was grim, more serious than I had ever seen it before. "You've made your choice," Victor said, his voice low. "Stay, and learn the secrets of life and death. Leave, and never truly escape the curse of Lindenwood." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I had seen, but I couldn't unsee it. The horrors of Lindenwood were too much to ignore. There was no escaping it. Not really. As I stood there, faced with the truth, I realized that I had already made my choice. The question wasn't about leaving or staying. The question was whether I could survive the curse of Lindenwood. I was trapped. And I knew it. The decision that Victor had laid before me, stay and learn, or leave and be haunted, wasn't one I could make lightly. As the figure in front of me retreated into the shadows, I felt the weight of the funeral home's grip on me. Victor, standing there in his usual calm demeanor, was unshaken by the terror I had just witnessed. His eyes, however, seemed to hold something darker now, a recognition of something I had yet to understand. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice cold, almost too quiet. "Stay, and learn the secrets of life and death. Leave, and never truly escape the curse of Lindenwood." I didn't respond right away. What was there to say? The truth was, I was scared. Terrified. Every rule that had been laid out for me started to make sense in a way I wished it didn't. Those rules weren't just to maintain order, they were to keep me from seeing things that weren't meant to be seen. The funeral home was more than just a place for the dead. It was a place where the dead, and whatever else was here, ruled. And I was part of it now. Whether I liked it or not. My legs shook as I turned to leave. The door slammed shut behind me, as if the house itself was locking me in. I could feel the weight of Lindenwood's walls closing in. I was being consumed by it. There was no going back. Not now. Every part of me screamed to escape, to leave this place and never come back. But as I walked down the hallway toward the exit, the house seemed to breathe with me, alive in a way that was suffocating. I reached for the door handle, but my hand froze inches from it. A voice, soft, yet unmistakable, whispered my name from behind me. It was distant at first, then closer, and closer still. "You can't leave," it said. I whirled around, my body tense, my heart thumping in my chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the overwhelming presence of the house. The thick air. The quiet. I could hear the whispers now, murmuring from all directions, voices of the dead and the things that haunted them. The walls seemed to hum with it. I could feel the eyes on me again, the eyes that had watched me ever since I entered this cursed place. No matter how far I walked, no matter how quickly I ran, I couldn't escape. Lindenwood was everywhere. It had claimed me, body and soul. As I stood frozen in the hallway, my body tense with fear, Victor's voice called out from the shadows. "You've made your choice," he repeated, more firmly this time. The air grew colder, and the whispers became louder. "You will never leave. The dead have their ways, and now, you are one of them." I felt a cold hand press against my back, pushing me forward. I stumbled, barely catching myself. I couldn't escape the grip of this place. Lindenwood would follow me, whether I stayed or left. It didn't matter. Once you stepped through those doors, you were part of the house, part of its darkness. And there was no turning back. As the last breath of cold air rushed through the hall, I understood that this wasn't just a funeral home. It was a gateway, a place where death and something far worse merged. And once you crossed the threshold, you were never truly free. The house owned you. The dead owned you. And they always would.